Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Hydragons Breath. Bow wow. Welcoming you back to another Archon's Alternatives. We are back at it again with our fantasy unit tier lists. Today we are looking at the monstrous units of Warhammer Fantasy. So, our categories are, as usual, ranked out of 10, with 1 being substandard, 5 being fairly normal, 10 being particularly unique. As usual, no regiments of renown nor any double dipping will be allowed, entirely unique units. Now, as you might expect, it says monstrous units, not just monsters. That is because a lot of factions do not use traditional monsters. I've had to pick and choose from several different options, especially with some more limited rosters. But how am I going to be grading them? Well, I have picked, as usual, our standard 4. The first rating is on speed and weight. This is mostly focused on a combination of how big the creature is, or the unit, and how fast they can move. Now, this takes several things into account. There are some baselines, of course. If a creature can fly, that is an advantage for speed. However, flying creatures tend to not be all that heavy, so flight is not just a guarantee of success in that category. Beyond that, however, it gets a lot simpler. The charge bonus of a creature, aka its sheer impact on an enemy force, especially enemy infantry, is quite easy to calculate. Weaponry is the next up. The collection and the effectiveness of all the weapons a monster has on both other monsters and on infantry. Now, this is important. We're essentially taking into account how much offensive potential a monster has. Plenty of them have lots of theoretical potentials, but this also includes any weapons or infantry with bows that are mounted on top of the creature itself. It does also include magic and breath weapons, so those will be their own bonuses for weaponry. Fielding cost, or reproduction if you'd like to put it that way, this is essentially, can more of them be made? How easy are they to make? And how easy are they to train? So that's a very important one that kind of drops down a lot of otherwise very good units, is the fact that they can be quite expensive and or very difficult to keep a hold of at times if one is not necessarily in the right situation to upkeep the creature. And finally, of course, the fairly subjective metric of style. Anything unique or particularly aesthetic about the monster, we will rate. So, starting off with our more human factions as usual. For the Empire and Kislev, we have a wombo combo. A little bit of old, a little bit of new. The Steam Tank, honestly one of my absolute favorites. The Steam Tank is wonderful, failing in only 2 categories. Speed and weight is one of the primary failings of the Steam Tank. It is not quick, trundling along at just a little bit over the speed of a running human. It is definitely not easy to maneuver this massive creature, mostly because of the fact that it is wheeled rather than tracked, and the rather archaic, in terms of modern day technology, steam engine that is used to power it. Now, if you know anything about early tank designs, they are notoriously unreliable, like to the point of abject uselessness unreliable. So in terms of speed and weight, you're not using the steam tank for its charge bonus. Where it makes up for it, though, is weaponry, a solid 8 here. The average steam tank is not only protected by a massive pavis of armor, but is, in addition to that, able to call up boiling steam from its own internal engine, spraying it out much like a boiling flamethrower or some sort of anti-riot control weapon, which is quite powerful, but it is also usually equipped with cannons of some sort. Cannons, of course, are quite powerful, and on a mobile chassis, it basically provides a asset to an army that is not available in almost any other Empire army. The ability to move around artillery quickly and to fire at the enemy accurately at a ground level is basically non-existent. The only other example that we have of this is war wagons with mortars, and I would hardly call that direct fire. Another failing of the steam tank is its field cost. So where weaponry got an 8, field cost only gets a 2. These things are ludicrously expensive. Not only are the engines quite difficult to maintain, not only is the armor incredibly heavy, but the ammunition, the weapon systems, and the trained crews required to actually field these things would be remarkably expensive as well. It is quite notable that in the actual lore, individual steam tanks are essentially assigned to individual cities within the Empire, or even micro-states. So it would not be too much of an exaggeration to say that an entire city, an entire section of the old Empire, is only able to field a single steam tank. That is not nearly as much as many other creatures in the old world, and thus that gives it one of the lowest fielding costs on this entire list. Now, do I think that it could be made in larger numbers, and do I think that logically it probably will be at a certain point because of the effectiveness? Perhaps, but at least canonically we know that they are in very limited numbers. Practically unheard of on the average battlefield, and definitely only showing up for the most dangerous of enemy threats. Finally, we get to style. Now, I am a huge tank nerd and a massive tank fan, and I could probably name you a couple hundred different vehicles off the top of my head. One of my absolute soft spots is early World War I armored vehicles. Not necessarily because of their effectiveness, nor necessarily because of their aesthetic, but because of the messiness implied in their design. The fact that something is being made out of pure and utter necessity. Much like aircraft in the First World War, tanks as a concept were simply non-existent. You had armored cars, of course, and perhaps even armored trains, but the idea of a tracked or a heavy-wheeled vehicle designed for all-terrain traversal, armed with a cannon and/or with machine guns, was genuinely a first for that great mortal conflict. And the steam tank feeds into that in a way that I think doesn't clash with the old world aesthetic nearly as much as certain other factions, like the Chaos Dwarves, often do. I have complaints at times about the technology level of Warhammer Fantasy, especially with some of the things that have been, shall we say, posthumously shoved into the setting. But the steam tank, I think, does hold up. Certainly better than some other designs that we may talk about later. So style-wise, I would rate it a solid 7. On the Kislev side, we have a newcomer, the Elemental of Beasts. Now, Kislev has many different monstrous units to pick from, but I like this one in particular for several reasons. One, it's basically a Wendigo, and it also kind of feeds off that same deranged tree man, demon in the woods energy that the Wood Elves do, and I could certainly respect that level of meth-addled psychosis, so let's start off with them. Speed and weight-wise, it definitely beats the brakes off of the steam tank. Not only can it travel swiftly through wooded areas, which no, the steam tank is not able to do whatsoever, it is also a bipedal monster, which means that it can traverse much more difficult terrain than quadrupeds would normally be able to. It can climb, leap, etc. without need for wings. It also is notable for being very quiet and swift on the move, being able to sneak through forests in a way that I don't think most monsters would be able to. So, for its arcane nature and its swift speed, in addition to its towering height, I would give it a 7 on the speed and weight ratio. Now, it isn't as heavy as other units on this list, but I would put its weight similar to that of a tree man, as I've mentioned before. Weaponry-wise, it only gets a +1 over the average for its spell casting. I find it remarkable that the Elemental of Beast is not given some sort of better weaponry. It is essentially fighting with tusks, teeth, claws, and horns. This creature is arcane, it has some level of magic ability, and yet it is more poorly armed than a wood elf treeman. Now, I could certainly see some modification being made to it, perhaps giving it a weapon would be a good idea, but even with those weapons, those claws and tusks, it is definitely slightly above average. Fielding cost is a solid 5. Now, I say that because this is a relatively new unit, the origins of which are, shall we say, shady at best. I mean, there are certainly references to creatures of its ilk within the old world before, but to actually have it in certain situations, for example, it is treated as a direct summon, as if it were pulled from the forest itself, again, very much like a demon or summoned from the ether. Now, do I think that that is canonical? Does that make sense at all? I'm not here to judge sense, I'm here to judge cost, and this thing is definitely average. I don't think that you could keep these around consistently. I don't think that there's going to be a reliable upkeep period for the Elemental of Beasts, the same way that I don't think you'd be able to keep around an Elemental Bear for long periods of time, especially outside of Kislev itself. So I would give it a 5, and certainly if there were some clarification as to how it was achieved, or whether it was a natural creature that was summoned via magic, or if it is a purely magical creature, a la the type of massive demonic monsters that come out of the warp, that may flex the rating by, I would say, up to 3 points in either direction. Style-wise, I give it a 5. Now, I would give it a significantly lower number. This is a lazy design, in my opinion. It is as simple as it gets. It is essentially a ripoff of a Tree Man. However, I am a massive simp for Wendigos. I have a horrible addiction to artwork that represents that type of stuff, be it SCPs, be it traditional Native American artwork and legends. I don't really care. If it's got horns and a deer head, I am a huge fan. People who've been paying close attention to the channel, you've probably noticed that I have a thing for the Wendigos. That stuff is so cool to me. So I would give it much lower ranks if I were not biased towards the design that they picked. So I give it a 5, to be fair. All right, Bretonnia. Bretonnia doesn't really have any monsters, which, I mean, you could argue that the Fey Enchantress herself is a monster. She is definitely an evil person. I would agree with that, you know. Women holding out swords in lakes is no way to run a country. I've always been in agreement with that. But the more problematic issue is that she's essentially just a manipulative bitch, but we will get around to that sometime in, I don't know, 2030. So let's start with something that is as close as I could get to a genuine monstrous unit for Bretonnia. The Royal Hippogriff Knights, also known as the most stick-up-the-rear of any stick-up-the-rear knight in all of Bretonnia. So, the French with wings have a speed and weight of about 6. Again, I don't think these things are all that heavy. It is basically the size of a Clydesdale horse. Considering the fact that it can fly, it is very fast, so I give it a slightly better than average score, but in terms of weight, it is still not going to be all that much heavier than the average armored knight on a warhorse. Can it hit at a considerably heavier speed? I suppose, but you also have to remember that flying creatures tend to have hollow bones in order to fly. Now, I'm not saying that every creature has to have physics applied to it. We are, of course, talking about demons and monsters here, but I will also say that the front half of this thing is a bird, and if it wants to get off the ground consistently, it may want to consider which of its bones are filled with marrow and which of its bones are filled with hollow tubes. So, apart from the knight on its back, I don't think this thing is nearly as heavy as people make it out to be. And as the game's treated. I think that the unit weight would be slightly heavier than a working horse like a large Clydesdale, but I don't think it's going to be much heavier than that. So I give it a 6. Weaponry-wise, again, you're going to be looking at the best of the best that Bretonnia has to offer. Big old enchanted lances, shields, specialty swords, very similar to the stuff that the Grail Knights are going to be toting around, honestly. So I give it a 6. Again, in terms of infantry combat, or if this was combating some sort of enemy cavalry, that would really do the trick. It would be great. That would have fit in as a great unit in our cavalry video. Problem, this is the monsters video, where we are now comparing things against monsters and against infantry. So, if we're comparing the Royal Hippogriff Knights against, say, something like the Elemental of Beasts, the weaponry disparity there in terms of sheer size, and not even saying that the Elemental of Beasts is well armed. We just discussed that it isn't. But in comparison to the little puny human wielding his spear and the Hippogriff, which, again, It's just a beak and some claws. That's not the most intimidating thing in the world. It is simply outmatched by a lot of other creatures. It is slightly saved by the fact that it has enchanted weapons, and also by the fact that there are more than one of these in a unit. I still think it's around 5 per unit, perhaps 10, but either way, it doesn't matter. At that point, you're just talking about how many of them have to die before they can take out something else. And that comes into a problem when it comes to fielding cost. Hippogriffs are fucking expensive, man. Expensive to upkeep, expensive to breed, dangerous and expensive to train. Upkeeping them is quite difficult. The knights themselves, of course, are very, very high maintenance. And I really doubt the structural, logistical function of deploying the Royal Hippogriff Knights over a long distance. For 2 reasons. One, the Hippogriffs themselves are not enormous. They're carrying a fully armored knight who could easily weigh upward of like 300 to 400 pounds. They themselves probably weigh no more than 1,500 pounds. And that much weight could definitely tire them out pretty quickly. And what's of course worse than that is just the sheer expense and cost of fielding them and then possibly losing them. So I give them a 4, again, just slightly below average because, again, on the individual side, they're probably less expensive than a whole-ass monster, feeding-wise and training-wise, but as a unit, they are certainly less than average. Style-wise, same exact thing. Less than average. There are so many just generic elite knights of knights of knights. You have the demigryphs for the Empire. You have the Pegasus Knights. You've got the fucking Thrasher Knights, the guys from the Dark Elves. I don't find the Royal Hippogriff Knights at all compelling. Honestly, I think that even the lesser versions of Bretonia's Knights, like the Grail Guardians, or Foot Grail Guardians or anything like that, I find those more unique units to be a lot more engaging and a lot more interesting. Again, I'm not giving them a trash rating because it's still a knight on a hippogriff, and, good for them on going with the hippogriff instead of, like, a griffin or a chimera or something like that. So good on them for going with a lesser known species, I suppose, and not just creating hippogriffs or something like that. Or sorry, creating like griffins or something like that. So I suppose it's good, but it's just not my thing. Grand Cathay have their own super weird thing going on. Celestial Lions. Celestial Lions are basically what it says on the tin. It is a lion with eagle's wings. It can fly, it's relatively competent at flying, but it is still just a big lion. This thing comes in a unit of 1, and it is not even as big as the average hippogriff will be. And its solo is not going to hit very hard. So I'm going to put its speed and weight at around 3. Again, it's good for, say, sniping out enemy flying units or using on the defensive against enemy skirmish units. I could definitely see it clearing up lots of enemies who have low leadership or possibly even assassinating certain low-level characters or casters. But by itself, especially against enemy infantry units of large size, and double especially against enemy monsters, the Celestial Lion is just gonna get batted out of the sky and obliterated. Because at the end of the day, it is just a lion. It's really not that impressive. Weaponry-wise, it is lower than average. I give it a 4 because, again, claws and teeth are fine, but they're nothing compared to the other weapons on this list. They're certainly nothing compared to many other creatures of its size. Even the Hippogriff Knights that we just went over are better armed than the Celestial Lion would be. And objectively in a fight, if it came down to 1 Celestial Lion versus, say, 2 of the Hippogriff Knights, the Lion's gonna get absolutely mogged every single time. Because it's simply not armed with any weapons that are designed for that multifunctional taking down of both large enemies and small. It's much more geared towards small infantry-sized targets. Fielding cost is a 6. Now, it is particularly notable that these are some sort of sub-breed of lion. Obviously, it's not some affectation. They are actually bred creatures. Now, does that make them all that expensive? I think because of the fact that their kit, harness, and training is relatively easy, it's not going to be too bad, but the fact that these are kind of a ground-up project, almost like a molder monster, they are going to be a lot rarer. In addition to that, it seems to indicate that they are rarer because they are in smaller groups. Now, Again, I don't give them a super high cost, even though that could justify a much worse field cost, but due to the fact that they're in units of 1, that still puts them slightly above average. You could definitely have multiple units of Celestial Lions just because you don't have to field them in large squads. So I give them a 6. Style-wise, I give this a 3. This is unimaginative. I really, really dislike it. I dislike the fact that they kind of just undid a lot of Griffin, Hippogriff, Chimera hybrid stuff and just kind of stuck it together with a fancy Chinese paint on it. I get it, because that's just how they treat Cathayan stuff in general. Undo a lot of the fantasy and then just give it a paint job. But at the same time, I'm not going to give them points for being lazy, essentially. I think there could definitely be some modifications made. I believe that making it look more like a manticore, which might have been what they were going for, because especially with the tail and the wings, it looks more manticore-like than anything else, and since we're not going to be talking about manticores, I may as well mention them here. A manticore would get the same exact stats here. It would not be all that much better. I could see this going pretty easily toe-to-toe with a manticore. I believe that this would win, just because of the training and because of the organization of the Cathayan army, but I think it would be pretty close. And if they met in the wild without any actual training or organization, I'm actually fairly willing to bet that the Manticore would beat the brakes off the Celestial Lion, or at least be able to kill it in a one-on-one, and maybe they would both die if it was a fight in the wild. So Celestial Lion gets a slightly lower score, and we move on to, let's say, the star of the show, or the first star of many shows. The Beastmen have brought one of the most badass units available to them, the Gorgon. The Gorgon is terrifying. It really is an eldritch horror monster, something that really does put the Beastmen on a different level when they have it. It's almost like when the Guard bring a Baneblade to battle. Normally, Imperial Guardsmen are not too much of a threat to lots of the advanced enemies of the Imperium. Chaos Space Marines tend to look down on them, Eldar tend to laugh at them, even the Tau tend to beat the brakes off of them at times, depending on who the author is. That is how it is with the Beastmen, but however, much like when the Imperial Guard show up with a Baneblade, the Gorgon can rapidly make everybody on the battlefield rethink their opinion about the Bray herds when one of them shows up. It is massive, many times the height of a man, 4-armed, huge armored tusks and horns on its head, massive mutations, enormous, practically ground-breaking weaponry and weight. This thing is bipedal, it is massively top-heavy, it is incredibly hefty in terms of its charge power, and in addition to that, it's disturbingly fast. It can run on 2 legs and charge with its head. Very much like we're going to see with Dragon Ogre Shaggoths, the ability to sprint and then impact with your charge is going to matter a whole hell of a lot more when you're this size as opposed to something that can fly. So I give them an 8 for speed and weight, and that is its highest category. The next highest category is its weaponry. The Gorgon is ripped with weaponry. It has 4 arms, usually 2 hold bladed weapons, while another 2 are used to grab and throw either objects or enemies. It really only needs the 2 weapons, if I'm being entirely honest. While they are not purpose-made blades, they are very accurately called like cleavers or choppers, or even just like claws or hooks. But even at this size, that is essentially like a giant pair of scissors coming down to chop anything that it strikes in half. It will be effective against infantry, it will be doubly effective against monsters. The Gorgon is genuinely one of those units that I could see destroying many other quality monsters in combat if they didn't have an option that either outsped or outranged the Gorgon. If you had to come into close combat with one of these things, it would be very difficult to overwhelm due to its absolute lack of sanity and its sheer physical mass and strength. What's even additional to that, and one of the slight disadvantages of its weapons, is that it is more geared towards fighting creatures its stature. Because it is so tall, it might struggle to actually strike individual enemies on the ground, rather having to rely upon long scything strokes with its blade, or bending over and grabbing shit. To its credit, though, it can actually bend at the waist and both grab infantry and slice at long lines of infantry, so it's It's not impossible for it to do that, it just has to take the effort to actually bother, rather than just running things over or smashing its head into the ground trying to cause everyone to die. So, weaponry is a 7, fielding cost is a 6. Again, very similar thing to the Celestial Lion, honestly. Because this has to be bred or made by the Beastmen, obviously it needs lots of modification to keep it up and running, the initial input cost for the Gorgon is relatively high. Unlike the Celestial Lion, and unlike almost every other unit on this list that isn't related to Chaos or to the Orcs, its upkeep is relatively low. All you have to do is feed it, and it will pretty much take care of itself. A field cost of 6, it could definitely go lower, especially if you were a Bray herd that had one of these on your hand by accident, which can happen, to my knowledge. It can end up that one of these massive, monstrous brutes ends up in your warband or in your herd by accident, and that might be a problem, especially if it starts getting a hunger in the midst of, say, a snowy tundra, where there is nothing except other beastmen for it to eat. It would certainly begin to cannibalize its own forces with very little concern. But as long as you are using it in repeated combats and it can gorge itself reliably, the Gorgon is absolutely going to take care of itself, and whatever relative upkeep it's going to need in terms of weaponry and equipment, the Bray herd is capable of doing without much difficulty. Style-wise, again, I give it a 6. The only thing that holds the Gorgon back from a much higher style score is the placement of its arms. The fact that its second pair of arms are so high up on its back that it limits its range of motion, especially down into the sides, really bothers me. It's not like General Grievous where you have arms that split into 2. No, it basically has 2 shoulders and 2 shoulder joints. This would give it more mobility if it wasn't so unbelievably yoked. So due to that little oversight, and also the fact that it can have some inconsistencies when it comes to size, in comparison to something like a Cygor, and of course the inconsistency of this thing's intelligence and its relative ability to be led, because a lot of that is kind of gray area, that's my one concern with it, and it's really a small one, so I still give it a 6. So how we stand for the humans and the beastmen: in top of B tier is the Gorgon. Next one up in C tier, we have the Elemental of Nature, the Kislevite, forest demon. And then we have the Hippogriff Knights and the Steam Tank, also in C tier. And then all the way down in D tier, interestingly enough, our only D tier for this entire video, is the Celestial Lion, all solo by itself. So, let's look at the Orcs and Skaven. For the Orcs, I have selected the Ragnarok Spider, a personal favorite of mine. I hate spiders. I hate spiders so much. The Shelob scene from Lord of the Rings fucked me up as a kid, and I will never recover. I do not like spiders. I do not like any kind of spider. However, I have come to a understanding with the Ragnarok Spider, for one particular reason. The Ragnarok is not stealthy. I do not have to worry about the Ragnarok suddenly appearing within my room. I do not have to worry about the Ragnarok coming around my house and setting up a clandestine web. The Ragnarok is a hunter, and it is quite visibly stunning and visibly striking in a way that makes it very difficult to miss. So as long as I cannot accidentally step on it, and in fact the Ragnarok is more likely to accidentally step on me, we are okay with it. So, beyond that disclaimer of the absolute nightmare fuel that is this thing, what are its stats? Speed and weight-wise, I give it a 7. It is going to be very similar to the next one on our list, which is the Hell Pit Abomination. It is big, it is fast, it is dynamic in its movement, but it has one big flaw, and that is its relative height off the ground. The Ragnarok Spider is a spider. Its lungs are located underneath its abdomen. It keeps those lungs relatively low to the ground, along with its mouth being located on the underside of its muzzle or its face, surrounded by several pronged or hooked or clawed pedipalps that it uses to cut up and attack enemies. Even with that, however, the Ragnarok is disturbingly mobile and quick. And though its charge may not be particularly terrifying, the fact that it is able to charge with its size, its weight, and the war carriage on its abdomen is in itself quite terrifying. What's also abnormal about the Arachnarok, as opposed to most other spiders, is its relatively crab-like and tough exoskeleton. This makes its charge a lot more intimidating. Normally with a spider-like creature, I would complain about the carapace and exoskeleton being relatively thin and chitinous and quite easy to break or bend, because spiders are not designed to be incredibly large and their architecture is designed for that type of light, quick-moving chassis. The Arachnarok is a whole lot closer to some nightmare shit out of the Carboniferous period than most other spiders, of course, and its charge would be striking several times more heavily and harder than a normal spider of equivalent size because of the hardness of its exoskeleton. Again, think much more crab-like than spider-like, so more carapace, less exoskeleton. So I give it a 7 there. Weaponry-wise, its major advantage, other than its claws, its legs, its spikes, its venomous fangs, its large pedipalps, is actually the goblins on its back. And of course, they are just goblins. What can they really do? Well, turns out quite a bit. Goblins are very, very dangerous at times, and especially these goblins. They have bows, and these bows allow them to skirmish off of the Arachnarok spider. Now, normally the Arachnarok would not be super great at killing enemy infantry. It only has 1 or 2 areas that it can attack from, and 1 or 2 weapons that it can attack with. Its mouth, its front pedipalps, and arguably its frontal claws. But with these goblins on its back, it gives it a massive advantage against dispersed enemy infantry. With that handled, the primary weapons of the Arachnarok spider can thence be focused upon much larger prey, especially enemy monsters, and that's why it gets such a high rating here, because that asset, the ability to have some allies on your back that effectively deal with enemy infantry while your primary weaponry is geared towards anti-monsters, allows for a very nice 1-2 punch gifted to the Arachnarok spider. Again, I give it a 6 for field cost. Why? Because it is a natural creature that exists, and of course goblins have been able to tame these things for a pretty significant amount of time, we know, in terms of just spiders in general. The Arachnarok being rather large does make it quite difficult, but once more, much like the Gorgon, as long as you keep it in combat, it will keep itself fed. So there's no real consistent upkeep for the creature whatsoever. You're just going to be looking at some level of food drain every couple of days. And of course, these are orcs. There is no problem with the Arachnarok snapping up one or another goblin whenever they feel like it and just nomming down on them. Style-wise, again, I hate spiders, but I love the Arachnarok's design. The War Shrine thing is heavily overdone. It really wasn't a useful thing throughout most of human history. I mean, it was used by the Carthaginians and India, essentially. The Persians used occasionally some, but they were more so a palanquin holder and a spot of designation. When they were used for open warfare, it was a mix of terror tactic and ersatz heavy cavalry. So I would say it's overdone. So I'm not saying that they weren't used throughout history, and some of them were used to great effect, but I will say that the whole Howdah thing is not nearly as effective as we saw it being in, say, Lord of the Rings with the Mumma kill. The Arachnarok spider is a very different situation. While elephants in real life and other monstrous creatures in real life would be quite skittish and afraid of dangerous creatures and afraid of things like fire or scared of things like enemy spears, etc., the Arachnarok is a natural predator, and the drugs and or fungus musk that the Groby oftentimes use to juice up their monsters can in many ways overcome the natural skittishness of such a creature towards dangerous enemies. In addition, unlike things like mammoths and elephants, the Arachnarok is protected from your basic bitch spear. It has some physical armor to it, and while the Howdah is not particularly large, the fact that it is manned by non-man-sized creatures, that it is manned by goblins, means that you can fit more archers up there, and I really do like that architecture overall, so I give it a solid 8 on the style. Now, let's get to the really fancy stuff. The Hell Pit Abomination for the Skaven. I will not lie to you. I love the Hell Pit Abomination. It is such an incredibly Skaven idea. It is the equivalent of digging out the garbage disposal trap on your sink and putting it inside of a nuclear reactor and then using it as a battlefield monster. Allow me to explain as I go through the stats. Speed and weight-wise, it is equivalent to the Ragnarok Spider. Why? 2 reasons. 1, it has assisted mobility. 2, it is able to galumph along at a disturbing speed. Now, not all Hell Pit Abominations are made equal, obviously, and though most of them do spawn from a Hell Pit itself, the Molder home clan area, they're not all just from there. There are some that have been developed elsewhere, though, again, mostly they are made by Clan Molder and then leaked out to other individuals as sold war beasts. However, they have an advantage here. As opposed to the Ragnarok, which is quite capable of using all of its limbs in tandem, the HPA is more of a group effort, shall we say. Multiple heads working towards the same goal, with an advantage. Usually the Hell Pit Abomination is buoyed up or girded up with some sort of assistive mobility device, be that a wheel, be that additional mechanical limbs, be it augments to its limbs, be it dozens of centipede-like legs. It has something that makes it go real fast when it needs to. So what it may lack in long-term skittering speed, it certainly makes up for in its short-term burst sprint speed or on the charge. So I give it a 7, and of course it is very large. Very large. The equivalent of, again, many other beasts, including, to a degree, the Ragnarok Spider. The weaponry of the Hell Pit Abomination is one of its major assets. Not only does it have the physical claws, tusks, teeth, etc. of the many different beasts and creatures that have been flesh melded together in order to create it, it also has the added benefit of Molder and or Scryer weaponry attached to its body. Now this extends from anything like what you see in the picture, armor, to steel blades, to warpstone drills, or flame weapons, or any other number of very much arcane equipment that is given to this monster. Now, it is not going to be using it in any sort of intelligent manner, but just attaching it to the creature and having it fling or wail or rip around haphazardly is usually enough for it to do significant amounts of damage. I would also add that due to the actual physical form of the Hell Pit Abomination, the fact that it has a very, shall we say, Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, 4-legged Centauride type design, with most of its weapons on the upright portion and then most of its mobility on the lower body, very similar to a Yinglong dragon. This gives it a massive advantage against fighting both types of enemies. It can rear up on its hind legs in order to attack taller opponents. It has all of its weaponry on the upper torso, and those weapons are all very well jointed. Again, you can see far better than the Gorgon's weaponry, and designed to strike at infantry as well as larger targets. So I would argue that it is, again, able to handle both monsters and infantry. I would also argue that the Hell Pit Abomination is probably the best possible monster for combating enemy heavy infantry. As long as they're not using halberds or pikes or something like that, the HPA is going to rip apart whatever elite units you want to throw at them. Reiksguard, or any type of Black Orcs, or even, I would say, several units like lower level Phoenix Guard or Swordmasters of Hoeth would be very much nonplussed at trying to take down an HPA by themselves. The fielding cost is very good. This is the reason why. Molder produces the Hell Pit Abomination as a byproduct. And I mean a genuine byproduct. Failed experimentation leaves over many spare parts that the Molder molders are able to repurpose. Effectively, they're able to take parts of rat ogres, chimera rats, various pieces of failed technology, and of course random slaves that they happen to be holding on to for some particularly harsh punishment, and stick them into an HPA. That is one of the reasons why the HPA is so unique. They're almost never made with the same constituent parts, and they could often be custom ordered. Now, that doesn't mean that they are incredibly cheap. They are cheaper than some of the other more advanced units, like the storm ogres, or the storm rat ogres and things of that nature, the armored ones that have weapons for arms, but I would argue that the HPA is pretty cheap, especially in the upkeep. The HPA's internal engine, its various biological processes that have been either cut off or repurposed, really does make it easy to keep in a battlefield. What's also even better than that is the HPA is completely insane, and yet it is tame to the whips of the Skaven. It follows orders fairly well, and it really doesn't flee from the battlefield all that easily, because it is, again, not a rational thinking creature. So I would say that fielding-wise, you have absolutely no concerns. The only problem, again, is the initial investment for Clan Moulder, and they will oftentimes have them on hand ready to go on the cheap side, or you can order them custom if you want something particularly nasty. Style-wise, do I even have to say why this is a solid 10? The Hell Pit Abomination is emblematic of everything that has to do with the Skaven. You could argue that almost all of the great clans are represented here. The weaponry and the hardened skull represent both Clan Moors and, of course, the Grey Seers, with the rat skull emblemization, the combined minds of Skavendom. Of course, you have Clan Scryer with the mechanical bits and the assistive mobility, and naturally this is a creature born from the dark madness of Clan Moulder. The only one who is technically missing is Clan Pestilence, but oh, then you forget that this creature has foul afterbirth that it causes when it dies, and dozens of plague-ridden rats crawl out of its intestines where they have been gestating, at which point they fight with the enemy. Again, thank you, Clan Pestilence, for being so unbelievably fucked. You are still my favorites. I love you guys. So, style-wise, perfect 10. Let's move on to the Ogres and the Wood Elves. The Stonehorn. I would argue one of the most overhyped units that has ever been made in a video game. Speed and weight is basically its best quality. With a speed and weight of 9, this thing is massive, it is quick, it is very, very dangerous on the charge. Possibly one of the most dangerous creatures on the charge that we're going to see on this list. Its entire face is practically impenetrable by standard weaponry, and it will gladly run itself into a rock wall and shake that shit off like nothing happened. There's very few creatures that can hit with the same actual impact force of the Stonehorn. Fighting afterwards, well, we can argue about that, but at least in terms of speed and weight, it is not lacking in any sense. Weaponry is where it comes in for just a little bit of slagging. Now, by itself, it is about as well armed as your average mammoth. Big old tusks, big old horns. It usually will have an ogre sitting on the back with some sort of pike or axe or scythe or glaive, or even something like a heavy catapult or ballista. This is acceptable, but if I'm being entirely honest, mounting artillery weapons on the back of a Stonehorn is kind of defeating the whole point of having a Stonehorn in the first place. Now, this thing is massive. Why would you not use it as a pure artillery beast or as a weapon beast? If you're going to use it as heavy cavalry, like Mournfangs are, then you should be using it as heavy cavalry and not mounting artillery to it. Now, that's a personal gripe of mine, and I didn't actually put it down into the points, but my main consideration is just that the Stonehorn doesn't really have any of the offensive weaponry that we would associate with other creatures. Even the Tree Man, for example, is armed in his own way, but they have a very similar stat line because, very simply, even though the Stonehorn is larger and the Stonehorn is heavier, the Stonehorn's weaponry, as it is with its spiked horns and its spiked tusks, are usually inferior to those of other similar-sized monsters. Fielding cost is a solid 8. These are wild animals that the ogres have tamed many and many a time, and they have managed to use them in multiple multiple applications, they seem to be docile enough to pull heavy loads, and yet to also charge into battle. So a very, very good fielding cost. These are going to be quite cheap overall. In terms of upkeep, and arguably in terms of acquisition as well. Style-wise, I give it a 6. This thing's just a water buffalo with a stone mask. I mean, I don't want to be really rude to it, and I know people like it a lot. I do like the overall design. I certainly like the size of this creature. It does remind me of, like, some of the early designs for mammoths when we were still pulling bones out of the ground, but, yeah, I think that the ogres overall clash with their naturalist aesthetic. I think that, honestly, the Stonehorns could have fit very well in the Norska lineup. Now, the Mountains of Morn versus the Northlands, where are they in comparison to each other? That would have to be someone else's video. But I think that it works well. My only big complaint is mainly that I think the aesthetics of the Stonehorn clash with those of the Ogre Kingdoms. And that no amount of putting random shit on their bridle or sticking an ogre on the back of them is really gonna fix that. For me, at least. For the Wood Elves, Tree Men, speed and weight of 6. These creatures are large. They are very similar to Ents from Lord of the Rings, but they are still bipedal. The main problem with their speed and weight that kind of drops them down below things like the Element of Spirits or the Elemental of Nature for Kislev is that they are made out of wood. Now, they are made out of quite quick wood, and they are able to move, unlike, other creatures made out of wood. But even for all of that, they are still a little bit stilted. We see this with individuals like Durthu and Drycha. When they run, it's not incredibly flexible, nor is it all that sprinty overall. So, Tree Men, not that fast, but they make up for it with their weight and their sheer strength. Tree Men are unnaturally powerful. Being creatures of magic, they have quite a bit of whippy and tendrily weaponry that they can bring to bear on the charge. So I give them a 6 and a matching 6 for weaponry. Now, outside of Durthu, Mr. Madtree, who has his sword, a lot of his fellows are equipped with more natural weapons. Long tree claws, dangling whips and ropes and flails, various magical blasts that they can use that from their arcane hearts and things of that nature, but really nothing here that is universally effective against both infantry and enemy monsters. I do see the Tree Man kind of getting beaten on like the Avatar of Cain does when you compare it to, say, something like Greater Demons. Now, that's not to say that every Tree Man is going to get beaten up like the Ents from Lord of the Rings. They are a little bit more spry and intelligent. They also have access to slightly better magic. If you're comparing movie Ents to book Ents, then that changes quite a bit. But just from the bare minimum, we could talk about weapons in general. I would see its more naturalistic side, the claws, the whips, all those slashing and stabbing and grabbing weapons, being far less successful against different types of monsters. Most specifically here, I'm thinking about dragons. And also about hydras, something that the Wood Elves would likely have to fight pretty consistently. I could see the Tree Man losing to that pretty easily, especially in a protracted fight one-on-one. So I give it a 6 for weaponry. It has very good weapons against infantry, and it does have magic. Otherwise, I would give it a much lower score. Fielding cost is a 9. These things are ridiculously cheap. They are simply available to the Wood Elves. They have lots of them to throw at the enemy. Now, they are a little bit more conservative, but not nearly as conservative as true Ents are. The Treemen are willing to defend their homes by aggressive means, and only Durthu is an individual so psychotic that he actively goes after anything around him. The Tree Men's only real hang-up is basically physically getting them to leave and to move. But convincing them that there's a threat to their forest is going to be a really easy way to get a Tree Man on your side. So I could definitely see them being very easy to field and very easy to regain, essentially, because their trees and their groves, as long as they are not destroyed, will eventually create more of their kind. Style-wise, again, I'm a sucker for Lord of the Rings, and the Tree Men just remind me so much of Quickbeam and Treebeard and Leaflock and Skinbark and all those folks, all those Ents from the Lord of the Rings books that I really can't help myself. These are so cool to me. I love the fact that they really do embody this kind of wood-woad ancient scroll work, like they're a Celtic nightmare creature, and then again, kind of that aesthetic of being forest demons. These like Viet Cong-esque monsters that come out of the darkness and just devour enemies who dare entrench upon their realm. A very strong environmental message, as usual, spoken by the Wood Elves. So I'm a big fan. I'll give them a style point of 9. Adding them in now, we have our first 2 A-tier monsters. The Skaven Hellpit Abomination, unsurprisingly coming up very high in the A-tier, and the Tree Man right behind him. Down below them, in between the Ragnarok Spider and the Gorgon, is the Stonehorn. Again, still in B-tier, still very good. And then, for the rest of them, they will stay where they lie. For elves and dark elves. For the elves, we have the various flavors of dragon. Now, as opposed to the dragons used by Chaos and the black dragons used by dark elves, the true high elves use a variety of dragons. You have sun dragons, you have moon dragons, you have star dragons, and then you have the standard reds and black, reds and etc. and the other types that there are. There's a lot of Warhammer Fantasy dragons, which is why I couldn't pick one in specific for the elves. They tend to use a lot of them, but particularly star and moon dragons we will be focusing on here. The star and moon are particularly large and also very fast. They have a speed and weight of around 8, with a significant advantage by usually having an elf on their back at their most powerful. But even without that, and I have judged these folks without that, this is just the dragon themselves, not the dragon plus rider combo, they still have a speed and weight of 8. They are massive. They are some of the best flyers in Warhammer Fantasy, and in addition to that, they are pretty big. Even in comparison to other dragons, they are still going to be outweighing all except for the truly massive black dragons used by the Dark Elves. Weaponry-wise, Star and Moon Dragons are covered in spines, they're covered in spikes, they have massive claws, and much more dangerously than that, they wield some of the most deadly breath weapons in the entirety of the setting. These are literally on the level of, like, cosmic wind fires. There are probably not many breath weapons in the entire setting that will match a Star or a Moon Dragon in full blast. Even discounting that, their physical weaponry is, again, superior to most dragons, in addition to the elves usually keeping them for a very long time until they have grown to a monstrous size. Fielding cost is a 6. Now, I would put this significantly lower if it were any other faction. The elves live, in many cases, especially Kalendor, in a mildly symbiotic relationship with these elder or higher species of dragon. They are synonymous with their race to a degree, and to another degree, they also cohabitate. The fact that some dragons are willing to build their nests in eyries and have their young looked after by the elves themselves clearly indicates some level of understanding or agreement between the dragon and the Aesir. Now, that's not to say that they're inexpensive to feed. They would certainly be quite expensive to feed, and of course I would imagine that an elven dragon raised on elven rations would probably not be willing to just eat corpses from the battlefield like many of the other monsters that we're going to talk about. So I have dropped it to only a 6. Again, expensive, very expensive to raise and rear. They take a very long time to field, and the loss of one is definitely felt, but they're not nearly as expensive as they would be for any other faction. Style-wise, a solid 9. These are your classic good guy dragons. Now again, the intelligence of Warhammer Fantasy dragons is dubious. It is definitely on that spectrum of however much interest the author wants to put into them, but there is again a connection between the dragon and usually either the elves or the riders. So they do fit a very classic inheritance cycle style connection between dragon and rider, and of course just dragon and elves in general. Now, if you're not aware, I am also a big inheritance cycle fan. I am a big fan of Aragon and Inheritance and all that Christopher Paolini work. So, again, this touches a soft spot for me. I have to give it a nice and lovely 10. It does not touch nearly as much as a soft spot for me as the next one on our list, the Dark Elves War Hydra. Ladies and gentlemen, if you know anything about this channel, you know my name. The Hydragon's Breath is a direct reference to a combination of creature that I once thought up as a very cool idea when I was a much younger man. The idea was essentially you took the classic Greek understanding of the Hydra, the creature with many heads and many necks that lived in a swamp and was much more snake-like or creature-like or beast-like, and had the ability for at least one of the heads to breathe fire, and then combined that with a classic dragon. The War Hydra is scratching that itch, ladies and gentlemen. Speed and weight-wise, it is again given legs, which gives it a massive advantage over the classic snake-like Hydra. It is able to gallop. It is not able to run necessarily, but it is certainly able to charge. I would give its charge speed and pace very similar to that of the Skaven Hellpit Abomination. Weaponry-wise is definitely where this thing also shines. As a mid-size, mid-rank creature, it is equipped with some of the most deadly weapons in existence. This many dragon-headed maws can rip apart all enemies. Now, it doesn't matter what version or interpretation of the War Hydra you want to use, even the Charybdis has a very similar set of attacks and a really similar set of damage to the classic War Hydra. These are armor-piercing, hard-headed creatures that have almost a vulture-like grab and rip style of combat that, even in their more snake-like configuration, are still able to snap up infantry or snap on and envenomate larger creatures. That then is augmented by the fact that not just one, but multiple of the War Hydra's heads can breathe fire. So again, this thing is terrifying. Far more physical attacks can be made by the War Hydra than can be made by any other dragon. And it has the advantage of a breath weapon, albeit not the most impressive one. Of course, it is nothing compared to the Star Dragon's breath weapon or to the Moon Dragon, but a breath weapon in a creature with this much physical attack speed and physical penetration using its multiple heads, again, like a vulture to rip apart prey, is horrifying. And of course, its sheer size gives it another option in terms of angles that it can use to attack enemies. Its fielding cost is what I would argue is its best trait. The Dark Elves have really cracked the code on how to get War Hydras onto the battlefield. They can have Beastmasters field these fairly often and regularly. The regeneration makes them even easier to upkeep because if they get wounded, they can quite literally heal themselves. So the Hydra is possibly the perfect Beastmaster standard. Now, whether you want to use hordes of beasts, or one particular large and difficult to control beast, the War Hydra fits your boat. It allows you to have multiple different heads of creatures to take care of, and it is in itself one massive creature that is rather hard to lose. So as a Dark Elf Beastmaster, it is pretty much the pinnacle of what I would expect for someone like Urian Rakarth to get his hands on as a young man and learn how to train. Style-wise, again, it's the name of the channel. It is the Hydragon. This thing is beautiful. The only thing that differentiates the War Hydra of the Dark Elves from my image of the perfect creature is a pair of wings. That is literally it. That is all that separates this from true glory. So, love the War Hydra. A very high score for it there. Those both go in A tier. The War Hydra truly surmounting the list as one of the highest stats on this list overall. And you can already see a lot of the builds going out. Most of these monsters will fall into A, B, and C tier. So, let us continue. Norska and Chaos. Dragon Ogre Shaggoths and War Mammoths. The Dragon Ogre we can go over quite quickly. They are again centroid, massive, chaotic creatures with a specific affinity for the storm. They are ancient, primordial monsters that have been around for huge amounts of time. They are titanic. They dwarf men by a factor of 10. They're able to crush down walls and destroy enemy infantry. Their speed and weight are unmatched. Their charges are armored. They are quadrupedal. They are quite flexible. They are, again, using that centroid architecture, which gives them a massive advantage. Their weaponry is usually heavily augmented, either chaotically created or combined with natural elements like lightning, and they have their own physical weapons, jaws, claws, etc., and they will carry massive weapons, usually axes, mauls, and things of that nature, that they can use to obliterate enemies. What is even more dangerous is the fact that Dragon Ogre Shaggoths are relatively intelligent. I'm not going to say smart, but I will certainly say relatively intelligent. And their ability to use these giant weapons to their best advantage is what really gives them this high of a score. Their fielding cost is again higher than average. They are friendly with chaos forces. Now, the only problem with rousing the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth is actually getting them awake. Once they kind of power down and sleep, they're probably going to stick there until there's a lightning storm that comes and wakes them up. The one other thing that will get them awake is dragons. They are big fans of fighting and trying to kill dragons. Now, with that said, do they have a massive upkeep? Is it hard to get them all their stuff? Not really. Most of them are so old that the armor and equipment that they have on them is literally on par with, ancient civilizations, and it's not falling apart or going anywhere anytime soon. And their weapons are, again, so monolithic and massive that a little pitting or a little rust isn't really going to matter whatsoever to their actual effectiveness. So, zero upkeep cost, very little actual cost to maintain. The only disadvantage is the difficulty/impossibility of recreating a true Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, and also the problem of getting them to wake up. Style-wise, again, this is a perfect 10. We're looking at something that really would fit in on the Titanic scale. Almost like the hecatoncheires of ancient Greek myth. Some truly primordial demon from the ancient world. Again, they remind me in the lore very much of Balrogs. These ancient creatures that roamed the earth and have these ancient arcane feuds with other beasts, and they see the new, younger races as just some sort of pests to be crushed and destroyed in the name of the dark gods. They're truly a wonderful lore beat and quite terrifying. War Mammoths, a very humble entry, let's say. War Mammoths get a 7 for speed and weight. They are technically bigger and at least a little bit heavier than most Dragon Ogre Shaggoths, well, especially the much larger War Mammoths, but they are definitely not armed as well, and rarely are they armored as well. Now, I am pointing out that these are the ones with some armor used by the Norskins, so their weight is really what comes in here in terms of that. They are also quite fast. They lack some of the maneuverability of the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth, but they do match it in terms of short-term sprint speed. What is also interesting about the War Mammoth is it doesn't suffer any of the natural fears that an elephant does, or even a mammoth for that matter. Its weaponry, however, is a bit lackluster. It only has the 4 tusks, which, granted, is better than the traditional 2 tusks, and it has a little grabby tip to its nose that, much like a normal elephant that can use its tusks to do things like pull out spears from its hide, etc., it can use that to grab enemy infantry and crush them underneath its massive tread. Really, its bulk, again, is what makes it so deadly here. I'm not going to say that it is similar in size to something like the Mumakil, but it is definitely bigger than the average traditional mammoth. Again, not mountain size like something like Krakenran the Black, but definitely pretty big there. Fielding cost cost is a 9. These things roam wild in the Norscan wastes, and all you have to do is find and tame one. Now, they can be bitter and bad-tempered, but the fact that they are there and they are in relatively large herds, often hunted by the Norscans or used as pack animals, war beasts, etc., shows that they can be relatively easy begot, and since they don't need to eat flesh, they can be very easily upkept with a supply of essentially grasses, grains, whatever you would like to say they get from under the north up there in the ice. Style-wise, this is an 8. Again, we go back to that Mumakil. We go back to those giant olifants from Lord of the Rings. These creatures are unnatural. They are truly from outside of the ken of the world. There are, again, as usual with these things, some sort of parallels with elephants in Araby and elephants in Cathay, but nobody would look at a Cathayan or an Arabian war elephant and even understand that it was related to a true Norscan war mammoth. These things are much larger, they are more dangerous, and of course, they are suffused with the power of chaos, which, in many and all terms, will make them more bad-tempered and quite difficult to put down in the end. It also has granted some of them a disturbing level of intelligence. Not, speaking, talking dragon level intelligence, but definitely some low evil animal cunning dwells in many of these massive, normally understood as gentle giant beasts. That is absolutely nothing compared with the Chaos Dwarves entry. The Kadai Destroyer, recently added and previously mentioned in several little snippets of lore, is essentially a Forge Fiend. Or more accurately, it is a massive Mauler Fiend. The thing is about 3 to 4 size multipliers times the size of a normal Mauler Fiend, but it is similarly equipped. It is huge, it is made out of metal, it is filled with molten steel and with slag. It is an animated fire demon of Hashut that is very problematic for anyone who wants to fight it. It would be hard to put this thing down, is all I'm gonna say. Speed and weight, it gets a solid 8. I would consider the charge from the Kadai Destroyer to be very similar to the impact of a Dragon Ogre Shaggoth. I mean, the only difference is leverage, and the Kadai is arguably heavier than a lot of Shaggoths would be. So they'll hit harder, they'll smash through things with very little concern for their own physicality, whereas a Dragon Ogre Shaggoth would prefer to use their physical weapon to try and break through something like a wall. The Kadai Destroyer will simply run headfirst through it. In addition to that, the weaponry of the Kadai is insane. Every portion of this thing is brimming with runes, and more problematically, with heat. The thing will literally melt weapons that touch it, in addition to killing anyone that it comes into contact with, simply by burning their skin off. It is hot. It is burning. It is going to create an aura around it where infantry simply can't operate. The only option is to try and throw magic, artillery, or beasts at this creature, and it is well served in trying to kill all of them. Infantry it can simply deal with by crushing them. Enemy beasts would have to physically rip it apart, and in order to do that, they would have to give themselves considerable physical damage trying to do so, in addition to needing to be significantly larger than the Kadai Destroyer to begin with. Fielding cost is its main flaw. I give it a 2. Again, one of the lowest on this sheet. This thing is practically unique. It is not replicable. It is very, very hard to create one, and the energy, power, and ritualism required to animate it definitely has a significant upkeep cost. Again, the Chaos Dwarves go around magic more actively than the Dwarves do, aka they do it at all, but they are also still more constrained than true worshippers of chaos. The worship of Hashut, of course, is still worship of chaos, as they are Chaos Dwarves, but it is more regimented, limited, and less, shall we say, messy than traditional northern-style chaos worship. Style-wise, I have to put this thing at an 8. I really didn't want to, mostly because of the fact that it is just a giant Mauler Fiend. But at the end of the day, in the Warhammer fantasy setting, there are certain factions, like the Skaven, that just have the cutting, bleeding edge of physical technology. The Chaos Dwarves are up there, especially in terms of firearms and artillery. The Kadai Destroyer is evidence of something much more concerning, and it is a level of chaos sophistication that the Skaven just don't have. The Skaven's use of their technology is usually hinged upon Warpstone. Where it uses magic, it uses it through the lens of the Great Horned Rat, which we know is disparate and separate from true chaos worship. The Kadai Destroyer is something more akin to 40k level understanding and utilization of demon engines than anything else in the setting. And this exists within many other examples for the Chaos Dwarves, so it's not as if this is without precedent. So the Kadai Destroyer, again, very, very impressive technologically, even if I don't necessarily like the physical design of it, because again, it is a rip-off Mauler Fiend. And before you ask, of course, as we move on, all demons, all of the massive demonic monsters, toad dragons, slaughter brutes, all of those will basically get the same exact score as the Kadai Destroyer. They will have similar speed and weight. They will have similar weaponry abilities, especially with the auras that many of those creatures have. They will have similar problems with field cost, especially because they are some of the most expensive demons that do not produce their own power, aka they're not greater demons. And I usually like the style. There's only a few that I really want to complain about, and I didn't feel like putting in an extra slide just to bitch about how I don't like the Slaughter Brute. So, let us continue on. Moving those into their place. Still up in A tier, we have the Mumakil, we have the War Mammoth, and we have the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth. The Mammoth is barely holding on with a 30, basically. The Kadai Destroyer is moving into B tier, where honestly it belongs, along with many of its fellows that have flaws but are particularly unique in their own way. Moving on to our last four factions, the Tomb Kings, the Kemrian War Sphinx, also lovingly referred to as the War Kitty. I love the War Kitty. It is wonderful. Speed and weight-wise, I give it an 8. Again, very much like the other creatures that we've looked at in its size class, quadruped, quick, no physical fear, no concern about physical damage because it is, again, more construct than anything else, and with the addition of, the speed that it has, it is able to throw its maximum weight of its entire body at its target because it simply doesn't care about self-preservation, giving it a couple of buffs over other creatures with similar or better weights. Weaponry-wise, it is only slightly lacking. The main problem with the War Kitty is that it relies pretty heavily upon things like Flame Breath, that is very, very short range, and it also relies upon its more construct-like claws and the people on its back, the skeletons on its back with either glaives, pikes, spears, or bows. My main issue with this, that doesn't apply to things like the Arachnarok Spider, is the limitations of these weaponry against other beasts. This is a construct. Its flexibility and intelligence are relatively limited, and in addition to that, the troops on its back are much, much smaller in number than on something like the Arachnarok Spider, and arguably even on the bigger versions of the War Mammoth that have a true Howdah on their back. This is much more in line with what we would see from traditional Howdahs. 2 to 3 people with melee weapons, 1 driver, and then maybe 1 to 2 archers. That is more standard from real life, but that also makes it inferior to some of the other creatures, giving it a rating of only 7 for its weaponry. Fielding cost is 5. It is purely average. It is not the most expensive construct that the Tomb Kings have access to. I would usually limit that to the big old walking sentinel, but it is also not the cheapest. We talked before about the Coffin Scorpion, the Tomb Scorpion, which is one of my absolute favorite Tomb Kings units. So that one is definitely going to be on the cheaper side. Certainly offers you a lot more versatility, I would argue, than the War Kitty. And even with that, however, I would still give us style points of 7. This has such classic Egyptian builds to it, and also because of the fact that it conjoins and it cleaves so close to the original understanding of what war elephants were supposed to be, I really actually give it quite a few props for that. So I give it a 7 on top of what could be just a relatively normal Tomb Kings unit. The Saurus have the Dread Saurian, and I found a very nice piece of art that gives you a slightly better idea of how big the Dread Saurian is as opposed to something like the Shredder of Lustria. Now, I am not going to say that the Dread Saurian is or is not a certain size. it doesn't matter. The Dreadsaurian is big enough and fast enough that it will give it the highest charge bonus of any other unit on this list. With a speed and weight of 10, it is hitting like an absolute goddamn tank. It is basically unstoppable. Even walls are going to crumble before this thing, even if it doesn't just choose to climb over them, which, being a giant lizard, it can. Weaponry-wise, it has a 9. Not only is it relatively well armed and armored with modifications to its tail, to its teeth, to its head, to its arms, shoulders, hands, claws, etc., it also oftentimes has a howdah on its back with large numbers of skink ranged units, which honestly are absolutely terrifying. The idea that not only are you having to fight this literal kaiju, but on its back is a huge number of poison dart spitting little bastards is really a problem. And this comes to its one and only issue. The Dreadsaurian is expensive. Even compared to all of the units on this list, it has the most voracious appetite. It will literally have to fight in order to eat. If you cannot actively feed it, there is a pretty good chance that it will fuck off back into the jungle to go hunting. Controlling the Dreadsaurian is hard. It would be quite difficult to field this thing for a long period of time, to transport it overseas, to bring it far out of the jungle where it both finds itself comfortable and can catch large amounts of game when it needs it. So I give it a fielding cost of 3. It is a natural creature, it can take care of itself, but in taking care of itself, it can also disobey orders and fuck back off into the jungle where it feels more comfortable. And let's be honest, who exactly is going to get in front of it and try and stop it other than a particularly ballsy slan mage who's going to try and mind control the damn thing? You'd have to see. Style-wise, I give it a 6. Again, I think that it's rather inconsistent, this idea of a giant crocodile, essentially. I don't hate the overall aesthetic. I think it's just the fact that the Dreadsaurian is kind of just a massive crocodile on the game version, and then if you look at the old art, it is a lot closer to a massive monitor lizard, which I'm more on the side of the monitor lizard. I really like this look that we have here on screen, and even though this would be a small version of the Dreadsaurian, I really prefer it, because it also would be more economical and efficient in terms of feeding the damn thing. So because of that inconsistency, I can only give it a 6, even though I really do like the aesthetic on this one. On to our final 3. Yes, our final 3. Vampire Counts, Vampire Coasts, and the Dwarves. Don't worry about the dwarf thing, we'll get to that in a second. For the Vampire Counts, we have the Rotting Leviathan, a massive crab with a ship on its back. And for the Vampire Coast, we have the Terrorgeist, also referred to as the Terror Goose. I'll be referring to it as the Terror Goose because I love that name. For speed and weight, the Rotting Leviathan is definitely on top, but not by much. It is carrying a massive weight, and even for a crab, it is a hermit crab, and hermit crabs are not very quick by themselves. They are not really ambush predators. They are not really quick chasers. They are kind of shifters and sifters of the ground. Even though, on the battlefield, they can slow and steady wins the race, and due to their armor, their size, and their ability to use their mobile home as a battering ram, that gives them a significant advantage over some small creature like the goose. It is not as significant as other creatures, even including the one that we have on this page, the Yoked Carnosaur. Weaponry-wise, it is neck and neck with the goose. Why? Even though the Rotting Levi is larger, it has a more limited range of weaponry. It only has its claws, essentially. Due to the fact that it is carrying a large amount of weight, utilizing its back legs or even its forward legs would be quite difficult, and while these claws are dexterous and capable of quite a bit of hacking and slashing, and of course eating, they are still relatively slow and crab-like, and they would certainly struggle against fast-moving creatures, and especially, I would argue, against skirmish cavalry, or even against heavy cavalry that was cycle-charging them. Now, could it grab and snap up lots of targets at a time, and could it deal with things like enemy creatures? Could it chop them up real good? Yes, I agree. It is above average when it comes to fighting creatures slightly smaller than it. The problem is that smaller creatures tend to be faster than it, and creatures that are bigger, it would certainly have a hard time overpowering, especially when it has such a vulnerable angle, aka the creature digging through its back plates and ripping it open from behind within the ship.
Fielding cost, a 7. Now, these are large creatures. They do have to be raised from the absolute and other depths, but they also have to be reinforced. Their shell needs to be repaired. Many portions of their carapace are essentially going to need patching up once they have been raised from the depths. Style-wise, I give it a 4. I really am not a huge fan of the rotting Leviathan. I think that the Prometheans, honestly, are a little bit more interesting because they're more naturalistic. I think that the Leviathan could use a facelift. The kind of crab-like architecture that they use for it in the game, I dislike more than the image that I have there, the more classic crab architecture. But again, that is a bit of a nitpick, and I really just don't find it all that inspiring as far as a concept goes. It's just a big old hermit crab. What of it, essentially? Terrorgeist, they're the Terror Goose. Speed and weight-wise, it has no weight. This thing is light. It is not very heavy at all. In fact, it is an undead bat, essentially. When it hits a target, the target is not going to feel all that much weight. What it will feel is the disgusting speed of something this big, able to fly this fast, and undead enough to not give a shit when it literally rams into you at full speed. It wraps up targets and rips them apart. So speed and weight-wise, it is just a little bit below average with a 4. Weaponry-wise, however, it is on par with even a creature that I would argue is 6 times the size of it in terms of the Rotting Leviathan, for one primary reason: the terror aura and the shriek of the Terror Goose. The goose itself is not terribly well armed. Claws, teeth, sure. Spikes and spines, yeah. An absolutely horrifying bite and mouth that may definitely is going to give you some diseases, yeah. That's not what's bad about the Terror Goose. What's bad about the Terror Goose is its screech and its fear aura. Very much like the fell beasts that the Nazgul ride, the Terrorgeist is scary, and it is able to break enemy units that would oftentimes be able to overpower it. I would argue that many light or medium infantry units, or even several types of light cavalry units, could probably mob and destroy a Terror Goose on its own, but with that screech and that scream, it can definitely cause them and their mounts to scatter long enough for it to chase them down and start ripping them apart. Fielding cost, it is very cheap. These things are a dime a dozen within the Vampire Counts roster. They're available as mounts. They're available as creatures. They're available as an alt form of Vargulfs, essentially, if you wanted to re-raise them and modify them to be able to fly. They serve as a dragon equivalent, and yet they are far easier to upkeep and to create when compared to something like a dragon or even a zombie dragon. And stylistically, I think for that same reason, I like them a lot. Considering that they could have just used zombie dragons or zombie griffins or even zombie eagles, the fact that they went out of their way to create a bat creature and then to create its devolution form in the Vargulf, I'm a big fan of. I really like that repurposing aspect of the Vampire Counts. You have a living creature that works as a war beast. Well, when it dies, we can recreate it and make it into something even bigger and more scary. That is a very good use of necromancy, and it's very thematic for the Vampire Counts overall. For the dwarves, well, the dwarves do not have any real monsters. The only thing I could find is basically that nowadays in the game, they can get a yoked Carnosaur, which is basically a domesticated and traded version of a T-Rex. And I also just wanted to get the Carnosaur on the list, because the Carnosaur is really cool. Speed and weight-wise, it's a solid 8, beating out everything else on this page. It is much faster than either of these, the Terror Goose only beating it out by flying, but even on the ground, it beats the absolute brakes off of something like a Vargulf. It has incredibly fast cruising speed, it can keep that up for several miles, and then it has a very nasty charge speed, and a huge head, claws, and feet that it can use to rip apart targets once it gets there. It is also yoked, so assumedly this is one of those creatures that has been broken into combat, meaning that it will have that sort of dead-eyed stare towards the enemy that will mean that cowing or terrifying it or causing it to go in rampage is going to be much more difficult, giving it, I would argue, a superior charge bonus to the average Carnosaur, which may be terrified or rout by psychological effect. And weaponry-wise, it is also very significant here. It's got much more powerful and stronger jaws than all of the other enemies on this list, but it also has the advantage of being able to jump, leap, slash, and grab like a velociraptor while being the size of a goddamn T-Rex. It will have a massive bite force. It will be able to grip, grab, and crunch onto enemy monsters. Its only real flaw is its lack of any natural armor. Its leathery skin is able to be penetrated by many other types of weapons, and I would argue that ranged weapons would have a particularly easy time damaging, especially a yoked Carnosaur that might be forced to stay in formation rather than go after a ranged unit trying to harass it. Field cost-wise, this is a 2. The fact that this can even be purchased by dwarves as some sort of mercenary unit, I find absurd. Again, I only included it because it is the only option that I could find for dwarves. If anyone knows a dwarf monster that I could effectively say they would field, I would be more than happy to do that. But again, same thing with style. Just the fact that this exists and is possible kind of defies belief, and I genuinely laughed for several minutes as I was reading the details on the yoked Carnosaur and just being like, oh my god, why is this existing in my fiction? But yes, overall, a pretty middling score, but with very impressive combat stats. So, here is our final rankings, including the Tomb Kings, Saurus, Vampires, and Dwarves. Up at the top in A tier, we had no S tiers for this, sadly. We have the War Hydra, the Hell Pit Abomination, all of the Elven Dragons, Tree Men, Dragon Ogre Shaggoths, and War Mammoths. War Mammoths being at the very, very bottom. For B tier, we have the majority of creatures, all of the ones formerly mentioned, including the Kadan Destroyer, and then the War Kitty, the Dread Saurian, and the Terror Goose. In C tier, we have what's left, the Dwarven Yoked Carnosaur, and the Rotting Leviathan. Again, this is basically a general spread. Most monsters in Warhammer Fantasy are quite well-rounded. The C tier simply suffer from some innate flaws, either stemming from the lack of their faction's ability to produce monsters, or from an innate issue with the monster's design that hold them back in some way. The only one in D tier is the Celestial Lion, and we already talked about all of the various problems with the Cathayan Lions. They are simply outclassed by a lot of other creatures that even fill their own particular role. So, I hope that you all enjoyed. Art credits go to GW naturally, to Panda, to Wolfdog Art, who we all love and know, Fadley Romani, Igor Sid, Brenthalio Art, and several others. So, there are several new videos incoming, along with what I am planning to be a pretty consistent D&D game that me and my friends are playing in and that I am running that I hope to record for you. That is going to be more of a listening experience probably than it is a filming experience. We will see if we can do anything about that, but in the meantime, just know that it is coming, that I will release some short intro videos, or that there will be portions of it set up ahead of time, but I will be hoping to record and release those on a weekly basis, hopefully on Fridays. Let me know what you think about that in the comments below. Of course, let me know if I fucked up the tier list at any point. The next couple of videos coming out are on the list that I posted. Your guys' votes have been heard and listened to. There will be more of those things you asked for coming up, especially on the Star Wars and on the alternatives front. But be not afraid, more and more series will get completed. More of the Enothis and the Adversaries campaigns will get done. I have taken your votes into account. And with all that said, with all that cleared up, I wish you all a lovely good night.